Hi, my name's Catherine, and in this video we're going to talk about when profiles have been used by the police to hunt suspects. Sometimes in a case there's very little material evidence to suggest who the culprit of a crime might be, and in instances like this the police have turned to profilers to give some insight into the perpetrator based on the behavioural clues which were left behind at the crime scene. And during the early development of offender profiling, there are cases which have had both a positive and negative impact on finding the perpetrator. Professor Kanter became known internationally in 1986 for the offender profile that he created, which helped the police to catch the railway rapist and serial killer John Duffy. This had been the first time that any contribution was made to a police investigation by a professor or a doctor of psychology anywhere. And it was also the first time that offender profiling had been used by the police in the UK. In 1982, a woman was raped by two men near Hampstead Heath railway station. 18 more women were attacked over the next year. Even more attacks occurred during 1984, and then 3 women were raped on the same night in 1985. And this led West London Police to set up an urgent investigation to find the perpetrators of the crime. Police further stepped up their search for the attacker, who'd been labelled by the press as the railway rapist. The killing of a young lady changed this label to the railway killer, and this tag was reinforced by the rape and murder of a 15-year-old female in 1986. As well as rape and strangulation, the last body was set on fire as well. To help their inquiries, police brought in a psychologist from the University of Surrey called Dr. Kanter. And he was working in the field of geographical psychology at the time, and there'd been no previous use in Britain of psychological offender profiling, as it was then called. But something fresh was required, as 2 women and a child had been murdered and numerous others had been raped, with little progress being made by the police. And Kanter examined the details of each of the crimes, and he built up a profile of the attacker's personality, their habits and their traits. And while this continued, another attack took place, where a 14-year-old girl was raped in a park. As the crime developed over time, Kanter saw that the crimes were becoming more determined, more planned, and they became more frequent and were perhaps the work of more than one offender. One of the most striking features of the crimes to Professor Kanter was their locations. Using their locations of the crimes, the descriptions that had been given by the victims and witnesses, the way that the offender spoke to and interacted with the victims, Kanter built up a profile of the most likely characteristics of the offender. The profile he drew up contained 17 main points, and he suggested that the offender would be likely to be living in the area which was circled by the first 3 offences. He suggested that the offender would be in his mid to late 20s, and he'd probably live with a partner without children. Kanter said that the perpetrator would be likely to work in a skilled or semi-skilled job and to have knowledge of the rail network. And finally, Kanter said that the offender would be likely to have a previous record of violent offences and would likely have been arrested in 1982 or 1983. And when John Duffy was eventually arrested, it was found that he was in his late 20s, he lived in the area which Kanter had suggested, and he'd recently split up with his wife and they had no children. He'd worked as a travelling carpenter and he'd previously worked for British Rail. John Duffy had previously been arrested for raping his wife at knife point. And as you can see, there's an uncanny similarity between the profile and the characteristics of who we now know is John Duffy, the man who was implicated in the crimes. The first point on the profile was made on the assumption of the circle hypothesis. And that means that offenders often operate in the area constrained by their daily lives. They offend in places where they know. The second point came from the case analysis of the way that John Duffy operated with his female victims. He would often talk to them during the act. And the age that was suggested came from the victims' reports. And the next 2 points on the profile came from common sense about when, where, and how the offences took place. Finally, the obvious break in time from 1982 to 1983 was the basis for the assumption that he might have been previously arrested. This was a very bare bones and admittedly a very lucky match to John Duffy. But today, with the vast amount of research that we have on offender patterns, we can judge more accurately the possible profiles of certain types of offenders based on their offence characteristics and their behaviours carried out at crime scenes. Although this was very much a basic attempt at profiling, it proved successful in helping the police to find the culprit. John Duffy fitted 13 of the 17 observations made about the attacker's lifestyle and habits. And such profiling then became commonplace in policing thereafter. And this inquiry he was Dr. Cantor at the time and went on to become Professor Cantor, to set up investigative psychology as a discipline. However, not all attempts at profiling have been as successful as this. Rachel Jane Nicholl was a British woman who was murdered on Wimbledon Common in southwest London on the 15th of July 1992. On the morning of the 15th of July, she and her then 2-year-old son were walking with the family's dog on Wimbledon Common, and whilst they were passing through a secluded area, Nicholl was attacked by an assailant who sexually assaulted her and then went on to murder her by repeatedly stabbing and slashing her with a knife. A passerby subsequently found Alexander, the 2-year-old, unharmed, clinging to his mother's body, repeating the words, "Wake up, mummy." Officers of the Metropolitan Police undertook the investigation, and they were under pressure to find the perpetrator from the public outrage at the circumstances of the murder, which was fueled by all of the press coverage. In his autobiography, Under the Wig, the barrister wrote, "Under the relentless gaze of the media, the investigators turned to a new development in police inquiries, criminal profiling." And a psychologist called Paul Britton was asked to create a character portrait of the kind of individual who would have committed the crime. And Britton gave the police a description of the man that they should be seeking. Britton proposed that he would be a sexually repressed loner who lived on his own, close to the scene of the crime. He would be in his 20s or 30s, and he would have an interest in the occult and in knives. Detectives knocked on the doors around Wimbledon Common and questioned 32 men, and they produced a photo fit which 4 callers identified as a Mr. Colin Stagg. He would often walk his dog around Wimbledon Common, and Colin Stagg was 29, he was an unemployed virgin and a pagan. A woman with whom he'd corresponded via a Lonely Hearts ad contacted the police to say that he had shared graphic sexual fantasies. And a witness picked him out of an identity parade as well. But he had no previous convictions. He told the police that he sometimes bathed naked on the heathland, and the police became convinced that they'd found their man. They decided that Stagg fitted the profile, and they asked the psychologist, Paul Britton, to assist with designing a covert operation, which was codenamed Operation Esdell, to see whether Stagg would implicate or eliminate himself from the inquiries. And this operation was later criticised by the media and by Stagg's trial judge. An undercover policewoman contacted Stagg, posing as a friend of a woman with whom he used to be in contact via a Lonely Hearts column. And over a period of about 5 months, she attempted to obtain information from him by feigning a romantic interest and meeting him. She'd speak to him on the telephone, and they would exchange letters containing sexual fantasies. During a meeting at Hyde Park, they spoke about the Nicholl murder, but Stagg later claimed that he'd only played along with the topic because he wanted to pursue the romance. The profiler Paul Britton later said that he disagreed with the use of the fantasy-filled letters and he knew nothing about them until after they'd been sent. Although he had played a significant part in designing the operation and writing some of the letters. The undercover female police officer won Colin Stagg's confidence and drew out his violent fantasies, but Stagg didn't admit to the murder. Police released a taped conversation between the policewoman and Colin Stagg in which she claimed to enjoy hurting people, to which Stagg mumbled, "Please explain as I live a quiet life. If I've disappointed you, please don't dump me. Nothing like this has ever happened to me before." And she went on to say, "If only you had done the Wimbledon Common murder, if only you had killed her, it would be all right." But then Colin Stagg replied, "I'm terribly sorry, but I haven't." Believing, on the advice of the Crown Prosecution Service, that there was sufficient evidence to secure a conviction of Stagg in a court trial for the Nicholl murder, the police arrested and charged him. On the 17th of August, he was charged with Nicholl's murder. But the case was thrown out of court and was heavily criticised by the judge for their methods in investigating the crime. Paul Britton faced a disciplinary hearing by the British Psychological Society as Stagg had claimed that there was misconduct. In 2002, with more advanced forensic techniques, Scotland Yard reopened the case. In July 2006, the Scotland Yard team interviewed a convicted murderer called Robert Napper for 2 days at Broadmoor Hospital. And Napper, who was aged 40 at that time, had been diagnosed as having paranoid schizophrenia and Asperger's syndrome. He'd been held at the secure institution for more than 10 years. Now, he'd been convicted of the murder of Samantha Bissett and her 4-year-old daughter, Jasmine, in November 1993, 16 months after Nicholl's murder. On the 28th of November 2007, Napper was charged with Nicholl's murder. On the 18th of December 2008, Robert Napper pleaded guilty to Nicholl's manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. And Napper was sentenced at a court trial to an indefinite detention at Broadmoor High Security Hospital for the criminally insane. And so in conclusion then, here are 2 different cases with very different outcomes using psychological profiling techniques. When putting together a psychological profile of an offender, it is of the utmost importance that this information is as reliable as it could possibly be. Many studies on criminal behaviour have been conducted since these early times, and any inferences that are made between crime scene behaviours and the characteristics of the offender are now well established. The use of rigorously tested data collection and analysis methods ensures that any inferences that we do make between actions and characteristics are reliable and that they're ecologically valid. It's right that this should be an area which is well regulated, well controlled, and applied with caution to cases. I do hope that you've enjoyed watching this video. I hope that you've learned something from it. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you think of the 2 cases. Thanks very much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed it and I hope that you've learned something. If you've liked the video, hit like. If you like this type of video, then subscribe to the channel. More are being released each week. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.